All right, homework help for 6.4. I'm going to take a look at 3 problems. Going to ask us to, or help you find out the dot product of 2 vectors. Going to look at finding the angle between 2 vectors. And then the third one is to determine whether 2 vectors are orthogonal, which is a fancy way of saying perpendicular, parallel, or neither. Alright, so all 3 of them are fairly quick in terms of the setup, it's just whether we remember the formula or not. Alright, so find the dot product. If you remember the dot product, what you are supposed to do is you are supposed to multiply the x components together and then add to that what you get when you multiply the y components together. So my work for this would be, here's this symbol, they would say it's u dot v is equal to, it's 1 times -2 plus -2 times 1. And so my dot product is going to end up being -4. Alright, on to the next one. Find the angle between the vectors u and v. So the idea here is it's finding the angle between 2 vectors. So I should say, well, that means I need to use the formula cosine of theta is equal to u dot v in the numerator divided by the magnitude of u times the magnitude of v in the denominator. So that's the formula that I want to hopefully remember and use, and that's what I'm going to do. So big idea, I need to find u dot v. So like we did up above, u dot v, multiply the x components together. So if I multiply -6 and -8 together, I know that's going to give me 48. Plus, if I multiply -3 and 4 together, I know that's going to give me a -12. So I know u dot v is actually 36. So that's my numerator. So if I look for the magnitude of vector u, magnitude, now remember that's the Pythagorean theorem. That's the a squared and the b squared equals c squared thing. So that's going to be the square root of -6 squared plus -3 squared. And 36 and 9, I know should eventually give me the square root of 45. Now normally I would rationalize that or simplify that, but I don't need to because this is not my final answer. It's just a part of this formula. So if you want to, you can, but not necessary. If it was your final answer, then absolutely, yes, you should be simplifying that. Magnitude of v, same thing. It's the square root of a squared, which is -8 squared, plus 4 squared, or b squared. And that looks like 81 plus 16, or that's eventually going to give me the square root of 80. And same thing, I would normally simplify that, but because it's not my final answer, I'm not going to. Alright, so that means I have the cosine of theta is equal to 36 divided by the square root of 45 times the square root of 80. And now instead of trying to type all of that in and do the cosine inverse just so I don't make an error, I'm going to simplify this. Nice way to do that, since they're both inside of a radical, remember technically I could rewrite that and say that this is the square root of 45 times 80. So I'm going to take 45 times 80 and multiply them together to get 3600. I'm now going to take the square root of that number, and ends up being a nice number. That's probably not going to happen all the time, but it does this time. It ends up giving me 60. And now I'll go ahead and type in my cosine inverse. So cosine inverse of 36 divided by 60, and that tells me that the angle between those 2 vectors is 53.13 degrees. If I wanted to draw a picture to kind of verify it, I could. Again, I don't have to be all that accurate here. It's -6, -3, so it looks probably something like that, this first vector. Vector v would be -8, +4 would look something like that. And you're asking yourself, does that look like there's 53 degrees there? I'd say, yeah, that does look like there's 53 degrees there. Alright, now, another way that you can do this, because there are sometimes a lot of formulas to remember, maybe you just don't remember it, or maybe you freeze up on the test, there's another thing that you could do. You just have to be a little careful, and that is figure out what angle that forms with the x-axis, figure out what angle that forms with the x-axis, and then just subtract the two. In other words, if I want to find the angle that vector u forms, I would do the tangent inverse of b divided by a. And they're both negative, so I'd take the tangent inverse of basically +1/2. And it would tell me 26.56 degrees. Well, think about it again. they're both negative. So I'm actually down here in the third quadrant. So 26.5 degrees doesn't make sense. I need to add 180 to it. This is actually 206.565 degrees. That is what that angle is. I'm going to do the tangent inverse with this one, and that'll tell me what this angle is, and then all I should have to do is subtract them to get this one. So now I'll do the tangent inverse of 4 over negative 8, or negative 1/2 is what it eventually will be. Type that in, tangent inverse, negative 0.5. And it tells me it's negative 26.565 degrees. Again, think about it, that's over here. That's not where I really am. Remember, anytime you're using tangent inverse, you have to be careful and think about which quadrant you're really in. So again, I need to add 180 to it. Well, really, this is 153.435 degrees. And now all I need to do is subtract them. And of course, if you take your calculator and take 206.565, subtract 153.435, we hopefully are going to get 53.13, and we do. So it's another way of taking a look at it. If for some reason you forget that formula or you freeze up, realistically, you should try to remember that formula. Don't block it out and just do this, because there's a lot of room for little mistakes. But if you do freeze up or you can't remember it, this will work. It's always nice to have another option if your first option doesn't work. All right, the last one, determine whether the two vectors are orthogonal, which again, remember that's a fancy way of saying perpendicular, parallel, or neither. Well, we know that if you find the dot product and it's 0, that means that it would be orthogonal. There is no rule for the dot product for parallel or neither. So I guess what I would do is, these are all slopes. Right? This is an x component, this is a y component. If it's y over x, that's the slope. I know that y over x is the tangent. Well, all I'm going to do is I'm going to find the slope of both of these. So the slope of u, vector u, if I take y divided by x, it's just 15 over 3, or that's eventually going to give me 5. Slope of v is going to be 5 over negative 1, which is negative 5. And now I know slopes, if they're parallel, if they're perpendicular, I know what the rule is. Parallel, they have to be the same. Well, definitely not parallel. Orthogonal, they need to be negative reciprocals. They're negative, but they're not reciprocals. This one's neither. And that's probably the quickest way of doing it. There's no sense running through and actually trying to figure out what the dot product is, because if it's not 0, you're going to have to find the slopes anyway to figure out the parallel or neither. So that's a quicker thing to do. Nice that you know that the dot product being 0 is going to make it perpendicular or orthogonal, but that would be a better idea to do for that problem. All right, that's homework help for 6.4. Let me know if you need any extra help.